How fast is the new Isuzu Impulse Turbo? How does 950 miles per hour sound?
Impulse Turbo.
Faster than a speeding... well, you know.
I want you to transport yourself back to 1980s and 1990s Japan for me. If you're a car guy of my generation, that shouldn't be very hard, seeing as you probably spend most of your time in school daydreaming, fantasizing about what it would have been like to live through that golden era of motorsports and car design. During this time, Japan was making some of the world's best electronics, home goods, and other resources. This meant that Japan as a nation was entering possibly the most incredible economic bubble in recent history. This, of course, led to the genesis and evolutions of more incredible machines than I could list. The Mazda RX-7, Nissan GT-R, Honda NSX, and the Toyota Celica GT4. Dozens of sports-oriented K-cars. I could keep going, but I want to keep this video at a reasonable length. People were getting richer, and both kids and parents wanted a cool and fast domestic car. So, unbegrudgingly, Japanese manufacturers delivered, in droves. By the 1990s, every Japanese automaker had a sporty offering. But there's one that never really made the splash that it deserved, especially stateside. Most likely that's because the brand itself wasn't one of the industrial giants that put out the Japanese cult cars we like to talk about and lust over today. As of 2010, there were only 2,300 registered in the United States. If you know what it is, you've probably spent all too many hours searching for a good example on Craigslist. You've dreamed about taking that car to events like Radwood and your local Japanese car shows. Or maybe that's just me projecting myself through this script, into this microphone, recording a video that maybe 100 or 150 people will see if I get lucky. Nonetheless, this is the story of one of my favorite Japanese cars of all time, the Isuzu Piazza, or as it was known in the United States, the Isuzu Impulse.
An infrared transmitter opens the door and permits contact.
As I mentioned before, the 1980s marked the start of the most influential and incredible cars to ever come out of Japan. Everyone from Nissan to Honda to Mazda had a halo car, or in some circumstances several. One outlier, for a time, was Isuzu. Most likely that's because Isuzu never really had as big of a stake in the consumer car market. Isuzu was a manufacturer, mostly, of commercial vehicles. Founded in 1916, Isuzu made a name for themselves making light and heavy payload trucks, along with other industrial use vehicles. Isuzu also started selling diesel engines in 1936, back when it went by the moniker of Automobile Industries Company Limited. Very original. Isuzu is not a company without a racing history though. Take for instance the Isuzu Bellette GT Type R, which competed in rally events such as the Group 2 4-door model that was entered in the 1000 Lakes Rally. Or, if you're not a rally fan, how about the Isuzu Bellette R6, a beautiful prototype using the GT Type R motor, built for competition in, of course, Group 6. I'm sure if you've played any earlier Gran Turismo, you've probably seen their most famous concept car, the 4200R, as well. Powered by a 4.2-liter, 32-valve Lotus-developed V8 and a 5-speed manual to boot, this could have been an Isuzu world beater had it moved into production. But, unfortunately, it didn't. And that seems like a great place to get back on track. That track being the Isuzu Piazza. When it came out in 1981, it was marketed as a fun, sporty 3-door hatchback and was seen as an alternative to other Japanese domestic cars, such as the 86 Trueno, the Toyota Celica, and the Honda Blade Sports CRX. The first generation Piazza, known as the JR 120 or 130, had a unique and quintessentially 1980s body, styled by the legendary Mr. Giugiaro. That's right, the guy responsible for cars as beautiful as the Maserati Ghibli, the Iso Grifo, the BMW Nazca C2, and even the Ferrari 250 GT competition Berlinetta. When the very first Piazza rolled off the assembly line in 1980, you could choose between two engines and two transmissions. One engine being the Isuzu 117 borrowed 1.6-liter single overhead camshaft inline 4, or a new, more powerful 2-liter dual overhead cam version. Transmissions were the standard offering for a fun small car of that period, either a 4-speed automatic or a 5-speed manual. For the US market, we got the Piazza relabeled as the Isuzu Impulse in 1983. Unfortunately, because of course, our only engine option was an anemically choked 2-liter single overhead cam 4-cylinder, rated at 90 horsepower and 108 pound-feet of torque. But, introduced in 1985 was a new turbocharged 2-liter single overhead cam 4-cylinder rated at 140 horsepower and 116 pound-feet of torque. We haven't even gotten close to the coolest model yet. Nonetheless, the turbo model had handling generally comparable to the Mitsubishi Starion for reference. In the US market, the Impulse was marketed with the tagline, "Everything Standard." This was obviously meant to imply that all Impulses came with all available equipment for the vehicle's model year. But that's not what you guys care about. You care about the more interesting models. So, here's a doozy. In 1988, as a sort of send-off to the first generation Piazza, they collaborated with a certain legendary racing team and car manufacturer and released the 1988 Isuzu Piazza XE handling by Lotus for the Japanese domestic market. This is exactly what it sounded like, an Isuzu Piazza that had the suspension reworked by the British legends at Lotus. There were very few made, and to the right people, it's an absolute collector's item. Isuzu United Kingdom Limited, the West Bromwich-based importer, sold the Lotus Piazza from 1987 to 1989, before concentrating on the four-wheel drive Isuzu Trooper. They never sold the second generation Piazza in the UK, nor was it ever sold in any European market. Take that, Brits. The Isuzu Piazza had a mild venture in racing as well, with an incredible looking super silhouette version competing in the 1980s. Built on a tube frame chassis, unfortunately it wasn't very successful, and not much is publicly known about the car. The second and as of right now final generation of the Piazza came in 1990. It had a completely refreshed look with more modern styling, and in my completely unqualified opinion, it's one of the most beautiful cars I've ever seen. With its sleek, subtle sports car profile to its incredibly unique headlights and taillights, the off-center intake on the hood of the turbo model was everything right about 90s car design. Lotus designed suspension returned in the second generation Impulse, which helped lead to stellar handling despite the switch to a transverse mounted engine and a front-wheel drive based platform. A non-Lotus innovation in the Impulse, though, was the development of the passive rear-wheel steering system, which adjusted the toe of the rear wheels by changing the wheel alignment through the range of suspension travel. The second generation Impulse Turbo was introduced to the US in 1991. It made 160 horsepower at 6,600 RPM and 149 pound-feet of torque at the same RPM. Combined with a curb weight of 2,600 pounds, a combination of all three led to a respectably quick car, in its either front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive form. Sadly, this generation of the Isuzu Impulse never really had a professional racing history. Then again, it probably wasn't in Isuzu's budget. Now here's a weird tip for you. If this video made you fall in love with the Impulse and you want to own one yourself, consider the Geo Storm. It was built on the exact same platform, and I would think they're slightly easier to find in the United States as well. For the 1992 model year, the turbo model was discontinued and the base engine was replaced with a 1.8, sharing the same bore with a longer stroke due to the taller engine block. This larger power plant was good for 140 horsepower, and both body styles continued into 1992, but very few were produced. Unfortunately, the demise of the Piazza came rushing in too soon. The combination of the burst of the Japanese economic bubble, rising emissions and crash safety regulations, and continued restrictive market segment changes by General Motors forced Isuzu out of the car market and brought an end to the Impulse in the United States. In the Japanese market, this vehicle was sold as the Piazza from 1991 in July all the way through spring of 1992, but only in the front-wheel drive form. And that then brings us to the end of our story. A truly under-respected Japanese sports coupe that, once again, never really got the respect that it deserves. Or maybe that was never the point. Maybe it was never supposed to dominate over the king of the hill Supras and GTRs. Maybe it was just supposed to be a fun car that wasn't exactly supposed to be a massive seller. I can't speak either way to it, seeing as I wasn't on the design or product development floor. But what I can say, at the very least, is that they made one damn good sports car.